What is up, everybody? Here we are with the May tier list. Finally, I've been putting this off for a bit. It's a little bit later in the month than I'd normally do it. That's just my fault. So yeah, let's jump right into it. First, we're going to talk about what do the tiers mean. We're going to use the same tier definitions we've used a few times now. I think since September. So yeah, the majority of my tier lists use this definition. S tier, very good. Top tier units, potentially overpowered units. Doesn't necessarily mean they're overpowered because they're in S tier. Sometimes it's just because they're dominant in the meta game. But yeah, best units in the game are the S tiers. A tier are the very strong units. These are the units that are basically just better than B tier units. Like B tier units are good, strong units. A tier is very strong. Like these are the ones that you see constantly at the higher tiers. And yeah, they're just really, really good. B is obviously just your standard good unit. Nothing wrong with a B tier unit. It's not an insult. Sometimes B tier units are too strong. They're just in B because the metagame doesn't favor them that heavily right now. So that's why they're sitting in B. It's not because they're bad. It's just because they're not amazing right now. And a key example of this is something like a Giga Cannon or a Chem Buggy. Both of those units are very good. Probably A tier in a vacuum, but in the metagame, more like a B tier unit right now. C is the ones that are okay, but you probably shouldn't be playing them right now. The quintessential C tier unit is the Banshee. It's a good unit, it's fine, solid multi-role unit, just not good right now because everyone is playing Stealth Tanks and Phantoms that make them really, really bad. So it's not like Banshee needs a buff. The metagame is just very hostile to Banshee right now. And then D, this is, maybe this shouldn't say absolute garbage, maybe this is a misnomer. I know people tell me these units aren't absolute garbage, so maybe it shouldn't say absolute garbage. But these are the ones that you just shouldn't play, basically. Either because they are actually absolute garbage, like the Juggernaut and the Scarab, or because there's just no reason to play them. Which is the classic example is the Flames and the Shocks, which everyone always has a go at me for putting them in D tier, but there's just no reason to play Flames and Shocks. They are worse than Razorbacks, they are worse than Snipers, they are worse than Fanatics, they are worse than Chem Buggy. It's just almost always wrong to be playing Flames and Shocks. There's never a scenario where that is the best unit you can play in your deck. Something else will almost always be better. So that's why they're in D tier. Not because they're complete trash. So maybe the absolute garbage is the wrong. Maybe they should be C because they aren't completely unplayable. But in my eyes, they are unplayable because there's just no reason to play them over the other options that are available right now. Alright. Let's start with the commanders as always. Here's the old commander list. Here is the new commander list. Very little changes here. Liang has a plus next to his S tier because he is S+. Liang is so broken. It's just the most powerful commander in the game. Still hasn't been nerfed. There's no doubt about it now. Liang is busted. Liang is just too good. He is nuts. So he's in S+ tier. A tier is Oksana and Seth. They're about balanced with each other, but they're both very strong. Way better than Kayn and Jade. Which one you play just depends on what your deck is. Sometimes you want Oksana, sometimes you want Seth. I wouldn't say either of them is necessarily stronger. It just depends on your deck. Jackson and Solomon are both B. They're fine. There are decks that play Jackson and Solomon. Like Zone Trooper deck plays Jackson. Aggro Solomon deck plays Solomon. But these decks are generally worse than the Liang decks. And then C tier, this is the only change. Strong Arm's down to C. This is just because there's no real reason to play Strong Arm. Like I said, there are some decks that want to play Jackson, there are some decks that want to play Solomon. There's no deck that wants to play Strong Arm over any of the other three commanders. Liang will just almost always be better. So unfortunately, Strong Arm down to C tier. I've been asked to mention that Jade is a good counter to APCs and Tic Tanks. That is semi-true. Like, it's not unreasonable statement to make. Those are just not the dominant decks. Like, the Tic Tank and the APC decks are kind of tier 2 decks. So bringing a deck to counter tier 2 decks isn't that smart because it's the tier 1 decks you want to be able to beat because they're the ones everyone's going to be playing. So yeah, Jade does counter those things, but still don't play Jade. Like, the missile is too easy to dodge in high tier play. Like, people will almost always dodge that missile, which means that you can only really use it with clouds, and then it's very, very obvious you're about to do it. Because, like, you move an APC up, your opponent drives a Chem Buggy in, or a Chem Trooper. Just don't surround your APC with other units. It's probably going to get missiled. And yes, you will lose your APC, but if that's the only thing you lose, it's not a big deal. Kayn is slightly better than he used to be, but not enough to move him out of D tier yet. He's quite good against the Rockworm and Titans that we're seeing at the moment, but that is not enough to put him above D tier, so he's still languishing in D. Alright, here is Nod from last month, and then here is new Nod. Not too many changes here. as you see, as the three units have moved up a tier, one unit's moved down. Not a lot to say. Stealth Tank Fnatic still completely dominant as the Nod metagame. The reason this has happened is because the things that Stealth Tank Fnatic are bad against are all bad against Razorbacks, pretty much. Like Chem Troopers are really good against Fnatic decks. They're bad versus Razorback. Giga deck is good versus Fnatic deck, but also not great against the Razorback deck, which is usually a Titan or an air-based deck. What else is there? MGs and Snipers are both very strong versus Fnatic Stank, but both of those are pretty horrible against Razorback. So what's happened here is Razorback is the best deck, in air quotes, and the Razorback has pushed out all of the decks that beat up on Fnatic Stank, which is the best deck to counter Razorback. So that's why everyone is playing Fnatic Stank, because it's good versus the best deck, and then the best deck has stopped people playing the things that are good versus Fnatic Stank. So Fnatic Stank gets to roam free in a meta game that is policed by Razorbacks, basically. Okay, so A tier, we've got Shade now is in A tier. Agent Shadow deck plays Shade as its last unit, the Fnatic Stank deck, instead of Scorpion, and it's very good in the Nod mirror. It's not so good versus GDI, but it's still okay, and you're mostly just crutching on Fnatic Stealth Tank against GDI anyway, so the Shade isn't that important. It's really just there for like Predator tanks in that matchup. So yeah, Shade is very good versus Nod, and against GDI you just don't really make it anyway, because you're just doing Stealth Tank Fnatic. So Shade is up to A. Same kind of logic as Laser Drones, except that Laser Drones are really bad versus GDI, whereas Shade is fine. So Laser Drones would be like an S versus Nod, but a D versus GDI or C. Yeah, like Laser Drones are really bad versus GDI and really good versus Nod, so that's why they end up in B, because they're good against Nod, but bad versus GDI. You'll also see Rockworm is now in A. Rockworm is actually a pretty good counter to the Titan deck. Oksana Rockworm beats Liang Titan pretty handily, because it gets to, even though the Titan is healing, it doesn't make a difference to how many attacks the Rockworm needs, and Oksana Rockworm attacks like 3 times before Titan shoots twice, or something obnoxious like that. So yeah, Rockworm is nuts. The only thing that holds Rockworm back is its horrendous mobility, and the fact it doesn't contest paths while moving, and it doesn't block while moving. It has a lot of functionality issues, but the actual unit itself is like an overpowered unit. It should be S tier. It is busted. Once Rockworm comes out and it's on a pad, removing it is, you have to have air, basically. Like, ground units just don't cut it anymore. The stats on the unit are overpowered. It's just the functionality of the unit that stops it from just being a solid S tier. Tick Tank has moved to B. This is because, again, the Titan deck is the tournament-dominating deck. Tick Tank is an actually decent response to it. I'm seeing Tick Tank Chuggy decks existing to fight this Titan deck, because Chuggy lets you kill missiles without losing to Razorback, and then Tick Tank buys you enough time against Titan, or stalls the Titan, or trades reasonably well against the Titan for its cost. So if you can use Chuggy to take the first missile quickly, then you can set up Tick Tanks for the incoming Titans, and Tick Tanks will do an okay job in that matchup. So they are a decent unit in the current metagame because of that thing that's going on with the Titan deck. I believe the Scorpion is still the overall better all-round unit, but in tournament play, there is a lot of reason to play Tick Tank instead of Scorpion. Lastly, I'll say, as I said earlier, the Banshee, the reason it's in C, not because of the stats, but because it's just really weak to Phantom and Stealth Tank, which is everywhere right now. But Banshee's actually okay versus GI. Like, it trades reasonably well with Pitbulls. It wins against Pitbull 1v1. It can kill Razorbacks and Borkers and so on. It just isn't good versus Nod at all. And that's too much of a concession, so I've put it in C tier. I think it's just too much of a liability against Nod. Finally, Confessor has moved to D. The only person who really plays Confessor at high tier on ladder is LessQQ, and I've never seen Confessors deep in a tournament. They just don't see any play in tournament play. They're just too weak to the Razorback deck. They're just not a great unit right now, unfortunately. I like Confessors, they're just not very good right now. Already spoken about Flames and Shocks, but once again, the reason that Flames are in D, not because they're a horrible unit, just because there's no reason to play them. They are the worst of the options. I believe they are worse than Fanatics. I believe they are worse than Chems. I believe they are worse than Venom. And I believe they are worse than Chem Buggy. So if you want an anti-infantry tier 2 anti-infantry unit, I think Flame is the worst one you can play. And they get super punished by Fanatics. I've had some people telling me that I'm wrong about this, but high tier Fnatic play dominates Flamers. Like, it dominates them in an embarrassing level, to the point where the Flamers are just a garbage unit. Like, they cost more and they trade badly if you play the Fanatics right. And there's no way to make the Flamers, you know, perform better, basically, in that matchup. They're just really bad versus Fanatics. So I really don't like Flamers right now. I don't think there's any reason to play them over Fanatics ever. Fanatics are so much better. Fanatics are just broken, and Flamers are fine minus. Alright, so moving on. Here is GDI from April, and here is GDI May. Quite a few changes on GDI this time. Not a huge number, but still a few. Rifleman is now A tier. This is not because I believe Riflemen are truly much better than the B tier units. I don't think they're necessarily even better than Dogs. I think Dogs are the superior option. It's just the fact that there's lots of the tier 1 decks want to play Riflemen instead of Dogs because they want to open barracks. So that means like the Razorback decks, the APC decks, which I think are very good at making a big comeback. Those decks want to open Riflemen instead of War Factory, which means that Riflemen are in A tier simply because they are such a key part of so many of the top tier decks right now. APC is in A tier. APC is very strong, a lot of hit points. Once it dies, it drops those missiles that can be frustrating to deal with because anything that kills APC probably doesn't do well against missiles. Also extremely good with Liang, which is a critical thing to be at the moment because Liang is the best commander. If your deck functions well with Liang, it's insane. So APC back in A tier. I think it deserves to be in A tier right now. I think that's a fair assessment of it. Zone Trooper into A tier. Zone Trooper has clearly proven its dominance at this point. I was wrong previously when I put Zone Troopers in C tier last month. Like I thought that with the bug fix, they would go back to being a more reasonable unit that was quite easily shut down. That's just not the case. These things are good versus everything. The combined arms of Zone Trooper plus another Zone Trooper beats basically everything in the game. Zone Troopers are just insane. You support them with any decent anti-infantry unit to make sure they don't go down to things like chems or flames or shocks, which is pretty easy to do. Like shocks and flames and chems, pretty easy to take out with things like Razorback and Drone Swarm. And then the zones just dominate everything else. So yeah, zones are just busted. They're potentially S tier, but again, Tech Lab almost precludes things from going into S tier because it is such a... You can't use them until quite late in the game. Once you do make them, though, they are disgusting. They are probably the best tech unit in the game. Okay, B tier, the Mammoth has gone down. Mammoth now costs 250 instead of 230. For decks that are relying on the Mammoth coming out and swinging the second missile, this is a big cost. It does slow them down by a few seconds. Mammoth usually barely gets there in time anyway, so now it's slowed down. That's even worse. It also is not good versus the Rockworms and Titans that are seeing play in tournaments, because it just doesn't trade favorably with them. So yeah, Mammoth not looking as good as it was. Titan, on the other hand, has moved up to B tier now. It would just be remiss at this point, with the sheer success that the Titan has seen over and over and over in tournaments, mostly on the back of SRPSS, but also Alicia has started playing the deck because she simply couldn't beat it, I think. That's what's going on here. She just didn't beat SRPSS playing it, so she just switched into it herself. It's just so dominant in tournaments right now, that deck. It's hard not to put Titan in B. However, I do believe the Titan itself is quite a poor unit still. It's simply the fact that it works really, really well in combination with the Razorback and the Hammerhead. Those three units can kill basically everything. And the Titan itself is indestructible with Liang, so it kind of works nicely on that level. Titan itself, I think, is, like I say, I don't think the unit is that good. It just works very well in this specific deck. So it is now B tier, but it's really just that one deck. The same reason that missiles are in A and rifles are in A. Not because those units are fantastic, just because they work very nicely in the current meta decks for GDI. Okay, so Talon has gone down to B tier. I don't think it's as strong as it was. I think the Razorback deck now often plays Hammerhead with the Titan deck. So Talon is a lot weaker versus that. Talon's very bad versus Hammerheads. Nod is often not even playing an air unit anymore. And if they are, it's like a single Shade rather than the Shade Venom combo we used to have, which Talon was very strong against. So Talon is now down to B tier. Still a good unit, just not amazing in this metagame. And finally, the Rhino is now in D. Again, same reasoning behind the Shocks and the Flames being in D. I just don't think there's any deck that plays a Rhino. No decks that go deep in tournaments or play high on ladder really want a Rhino. It's a very uncommon unit to see. It's very easily punished. Buggy, I think, sees a little bit of play still. There are some decks where I think Buggy is okay. I just don't think you ever want to play a Rhino, really. There are decks that want to play Shatterer, and sometimes Rhino is played in those decks, but those decks should probably just be playing Shatterer. So Rhino, I think, not living his best life right now. He's sitting in D tier, and I'm pretty comfortable with that. Alright guys, hope you enjoyed that tier list. Obviously, I know there's going to be differences of opinions. Love to hear what you guys think about the tier list and why you think different things should be rated the way they are. So yeah, like to hear from you guys in comments. So let me know what you guys think, and I'll see you all next time.